IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. The WHO, the World Health Organization, has recently come out with a framework for governing human gene editing. Now, the genetic editing of human beings is something that is, for a lot of reasons, quite controversial. I'm joined today by Dr. Shambhavi Nayak. Hi, Doc.
Hi, Anirudh.
So, Shambhavi and I worked on a framework to govern gene editing applications in India more generally a couple of years ago, soon after I joined Takshashila. It was, in fact, my first serious research output. And what we had done was basically recommend a framework that India can use to decide which kind of applications of gene editing require priority, which kind of applications pose minimal environmental risk, and therefore can do with a little less regulation in order to promote innovation. This included stuff like genetically modifying crops and so on, in a way that would help India to tackle stuff like climate change and the other challenges that are likely to come up in the coming decades. But human gene editing is a whole different ballgame. Obviously, a human being is a far more complicated creature than a plant. A human being also brings up a lot of moral and ethical issues that you might not necessarily face while raising a plant. So what we'll be doing over the course of this episode is trying to understand broadly the issues that come up when one thinks about human gene editing, the potential benefits that it can unlock for society, the potential risks that it poses and the ways that those risks can be managed in, and try to think about whether this WHO framework provides a guiding light or at least some questions that India can use to frame its own policy towards human genome editing. Right now, what India does is fairly restrictive, but we'll get into that in a little more detail over the course of this conversation. So let's get started, Doc. Can you tell us first, what are the issues with human gene editing? Let's say that I have the option to cure myself and all my descendants of asthma and of short-sightedness. It seems like something that's a no-brainer, right? Something that I should absolutely do. But what kind of ramifications might it have for myself and for humanity as a whole if I were to engage in that sort of activity?
Right. So there are two main concerns when we think of gene editing. One is the fact that we are scientifically not there yet. In the recent years, we have made tremendous progress in what we can actually edit and the processes that we use for editing human cells, but it is not perfect yet. So there are those concerns which continue to run throughout, and we don't want unscrupulous networks coming in and usurping the narrative of gene editing by targeting vulnerable people and creating this biohacking kind of a scenario where people are duped with aspirations that are scientifically not possible, right?
Or with fears that are scientifically not plausible. I mean, if you look at the furor that was created over genetically modified crops, in India especially, they were made out to be this deadly sort of thing that would carry disease and would impoverish farmers, and farmers groups were all up in arms over it, which ended with India banning genetically modified crops such as cannoli, while ironically continuing to be the world's largest importer of genetically modified cannoli oil. So that kind of, it seems like either extreme is very dangerous, right? On the one hand, the fact that the COVID pandemic, especially in its early stages, was considered to be a bioweapon, a genetically engineered bioweapon, and also that India has this somewhat politically contested history with genetically modified organisms, might potentially lead to conversations around a potentially beneficial technology being hijacked by people who don't necessarily fully understand its benefits or its risks.
Right. And this is something that we, I think, spoke a lot of in our discussion document as well, right? Is that, look, the technology by itself can do good, can do harm. It's the applications that we really need to look at. And so putting those two things in the same bucket doesn't make any sense. We should look at applications differently, and how each application can be regulated depends on the benefits and risks that particular application brings. And this, I'm very happy to see, something that the WHO framework also talks about right at the beginning. It makes this point that, hey, we need to look at each application separately, and then you basically have a pyramidal structure at how restrictive or how permissive you want to be with your regulation, and that I have to say, is very similar to the structure that we had originally thought of, right, back 2 years ago now.
So, I did find this idea. I mean, it's like they basically framed what we were saying in somewhat different words. The idea that the potential applications of a technology might merit different consideration. They even subscribe to this kind of 3-level separation of the risks involved and the amount of governance that might be required for various kinds of applications. So that was definitely interesting, and I think it just goes to show, of course, that we are geniuses who are far ahead of our time.
Of course.
But in all seriousness, right? Let's talk a little bit about human genome editing.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, we didn't speak about the second challenge of gene editing. So scientifically, concerns remain. The fact is that science concerns can be addressed by policy, and that scientific research will hopefully solve them as we go ahead. The other main concern is obviously ethics. The ethics of using gene editing to, basically interfere with what people believe is God's work, it's nature, and you should not be tampering nature. And particularly when it comes to germline gene editing and editing the genomes of future descendants, of whether you actually have the consent to do that. So ethics is a big part of the discussion when it comes to gene editing governance. And I think this particular framework that the WHO has released it holds the conversation really well. On ethics, it is not judgmental. It doesn't say something to be right or wrong. So we often hear that germline gene editing is unethical, it is wrong, it should be banned. This framework doesn't call it out. Instead, it says that, hey, you need to figure this out at a local level. Societal engagement to be able to figure this out in your country on whether this is acceptable or not. What are the other things that are acceptable in your country? What are the other rules and regulations that you abide by? And how does any form of gene editing fit into those? These are all concerns that need to be addressed by individual countries. But I think the WHO framework does a really good job in calling them out.
So let's try to understand this local context in India a little better, right? On the one hand, because India doesn't necessarily come from the same kind of Abrahamic view of creation, and does not seem as obsessed, in my experience, with the idea that God's creation cannot be tampered with. One would expect that, yes, societally, India would be more open to kind of progressive new ways of editing the genome. On the other hand, societally and politically, India offers an interesting picture because perhaps more than any other industrializing and developing country, the political myth of the farmer, leave aside whether or not politicians actually do anything that benefits them, the political myth of the farmer remains extremely powerful, especially in media. Even though farmers have led some pretty massive protests in the capital over the last couple of years without receiving a lot of media attention, one can't deny that a politician who portrays himself as being pro-farmer is automatically far more popular with the urban middle classes than one who does not. And this, of course, makes the image of this farmer who may or may not be exploited by global corporations and who should ideally sit around and do nothing but Ayurvedic farming, very easy to kind of be picked up by other political interests, especially political interests who might not be as scientifically progressive as we might like. And there is quite a difference between modifying the genome of a plant, potentially improving India's food security, and modifying the genome of a human being and potentially indelibly changing the genetic heritage, if I can use that term, that all of us share as part of our human heritage. What if societally Indians feel that dark skin is just not something that we want, and we're going to edit it out of our bloodlines over the next few decades? Or what if they decide that certain kinds of physical disabilities, like blindness or deafness, which blind people or deaf people might not necessarily see as a disability, what if the mainstream societal view is that these are undesirable and that they should be wiped out? What about stuff like Down syndrome? There's a huge array of potential genetic conditions, which once we open the gateways to societal majoritarianism, deciding what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in a human body, you potentially clear the way for a far more discriminatory kind of regime, especially when you have the technology to modify bodies as you see fit. Another issue that I can think of, leaving aside what Indian society might decide to do to itself physically, there's also the broader ethical issue of whether we have the right to determine what future generations should look like. Whether, for example, if a rich couple decides that they want their descendants to have super muscles, and their grandchildren decide that they want their descendants to have super brains with more preferential access to more sophisticated gene editing technologies, might we see a highly unequal world where the rich are basically immortal superhumans, and the poor do not have access to these kind of technologies and therefore live a far less healthy, a far less fulfilled life? How do we really grapple with those kind of questions?
You have left me with a lot to unpack here. So I'm going to try and see if I can answer all of your things one by one. The first one about whether India is more open to, say, germline gene editing than other countries. I think that's a conversation we need to have. I think that's the first conversation that we need to have, and that we have completely kind of skipped and neglected having an understanding of. I think we have had committees that the DBT has set up when it came up with its own set of guidelines last year, but I don't think there has been a focused engagement with the public to figure out whether a normal person who's not part of the government establishment in India or of the scientific establishment, what do they feel about having this technology? What do they feel about using this technology to improve their future generations, right? And the impact that will have. We just haven't had it. In the US, we have had a report from the Pew Research Center which suggested that American civilians were okay with using germline gene editing to edit babies if it was going to remove a severe disease that would have led to death eventually. So we have that data, but we actually have no idea what happens in India or what do the Indian people feel. And again, the WHO framework also talks about the fact that this is a very important element when you think about gene editing governance, right? Particularly in a heterogeneous group that we are. I think that's a conversation we really, really should have. Second, with the way politicians or the political narrative will grow, it is extremely difficult to know. Even with the GMOs, for example, over the past couple of years, we have seen a lot of farmer groups protesting for GMOs to be brought in. That still hasn't swayed political support for GMOs to the level that we would have expected or we would need. So I really don't understand how the political dynamics of all of this will work. But hopefully, we will see at least some kind of, as the world together moves to genetically edited humans, hopefully we will see some kind of push in that area. I always remember this conversation that was held in Parliament when they were discussing the DNA regulatory bill, which has nothing to do with gene editing. It is a bill that basically creates a DNA data bank for forensic purpose. And one of the MPs stood up while defending the bill and said that, hey, look, there's this Chinese scientist who's making genetically edited babies in China. Why should we be left behind? We also need to step up science. Obviously had absolutely nothing to do with gene editing, but still, there is at least some kind of recognition that this is an area of science that we need to get a move on. Third, and the more complicated thing, is the ethics and the possibilities of what we can do, right? There are, again, scientific limitations to what we can do, not just in terms of the technology, but in terms of what we know of ourselves, right? And one of gene editing's main use is for us to understand more of how our genes work and what do they control in our body. But it will also shine a light on how little we know of ourselves. Intelligence, for example. We really don't know how it is genetically controlled. Obviously, there is a nurture element to it as well. But we simply don't know which genes control it. So, which all genes control it, rather. And so, creating super intelligent babies is probably farther along the way than, say, curing thalassemia, right? Where we know what is wrong with the person's genes. And changing it. The examples that we often hear of, for example, like a supramuscular baby. I think there's also, the supramuscular baby also is in the WHO framework. They've given scenarios of how gene editing can be used. And they talk about the parents who want a supramuscular baby to compete in Olympics and how will that work. I think those examples are extreme and are actually easier to call out on than the examples in the gray area or marginal areas, which are a little difficult for us to, at this point of time, figure how do we actually go about approaching them, right? So if I say that, hey, a muscular baby I want to create a muscular baby to take part in the Olympics, your immediate thought process is, hey, no, That doesn't make sense, right? That just sounds wrong.
That seems right.
But if I say that, hey, look, or the example that you took, for example, about dark skin and light skin, and I'm in a society where people prefer lighter skin individuals, and therefore will that cause inequality? That example is actually it's difficult to judge, because again, on the face of it, you would be like, no, we should not allow skin enhancement rather, as a gene editing application, because it's an enhancement. It might not serve a purpose. But there are people in this country who have had trauma because of their skin color, who have been looked down upon because of their skin color. And if they believe that they have a right to being liberated from that situation because they can genetically edit to a lighter skin, I don't know how it is ethically anybody else's decision to make on whether they should be allowed to do that or not. Those are the conversations we need to have on how do we tackle these things. The deafness example, for example, that you took, right? Where if you do not believe you have a disability, nobody should have the right to force upon you a treatment what they think is a treatment. It's something, again, that the framework that the WHO guideline document talks about is that we have to look at gene editing as a tool, and when we do that, we have to not disregard that anyone who doesn't want to choose that tool to change their life, and this could be for an economic reason, this could be from a purely personal choice reason, that their disability to do that is not looked down upon. They are not discriminated because they have not chosen to be an improved self. And I think that is going to be very, very important, because that reflects on broader societal concerns that we have, that gene editing could be aggravating. But these are limitations of our society that are very deeply rooted, right? That we will look down upon certain people or certain disabilities. It is inherent to society, and changing that is not part of gene editing's role.
I agree, but see, that's the thing, right? While I think I have no objection to the idea that yes, people have the absolute right to choose whether their bodies and their bloodlines can be modified or not modified by gene editing. But we don't live in an ideal world. We live in a society where it might very well be possible that, let's say, technology advances to a point where it's more accessible, or at least accessible to like a fair number of people in society. Mm-hmm. What if it becomes a norm to modify your kids? What if it's a societal norm to progressively engineer more and more intelligent kids, or more and more fair looking kids, or kids who look more and more like, I don't know, a freaking potato or something? And the basic point is that,
or like Krypton, where kids are made to order, like you're born into the job that you're supposed to do.
If that becomes a societal norm, then not genetically modifying your kid and potentially exposing them to societal ridicule also becomes ethically problematic. What if genetic modification becomes as normal as vaccination, for example? Right? It's difficult to make a public health case for it when you're looking at enhancements such as improved musculature or improved height, that kind of stuff. But what about stuff like a heritable disease? Is there a moral obligation upon the parent to make sure that they don't transfer a heritable disease down to their kids? Should it not be the parent's choice to have children as they see fit? What if the parent does not see their heritable condition as something that impedes their dignity, something they don't want to edit their kid out of? It just becomes really complicated, right? Because it becomes a supremely morally complicated question, and it's difficult to come up with a society-wide solution to it all. And while I agree that yes, in principle, these are conversations we need to be having, how do we have these conversations? What about 21st century society makes us think that we are mature enough to have such complicated ethical debates in a day and age where 90% of social media conversation seems to be about conspiracy theories, echoes of a long forgotten past, which is all about genetically modifying elephants and stitching their heads onto human beings and and having babies in clay pots and that kind of stuff.
But it doesn't have to be, no? I mean, look, as a government or as a governance framework, your responsibility is to make sure that the person who is choosing to undergo a certain therapy or a treatment has all the information on the benefits and risks of what they're doing, and has the option of choosing that, right? So for example, if you say let us ban germline gene editing completely, then you're just taking away the option, right? You're saying as a society, you do not have this option at all. But I think in a governance framework, what you should be able to do is basically say that, look, these are the risks of doing germline gene editing. We believe we are scientifically not there yet to be doing this. But if you have a safe enough option available, then I don't see why the government can come and say that, no, look, we're taking away this option from you, right? So I think from a governance perspective, the idea is that you provide as much of the information as you can to the eventual recipient. These choices are hard to make, right? They're hard to make even for other things like vaccination, for example. There are a lot of parents who don't vaccinate their kids because they think vaccination will give them autism. Choosing to go to a government school in India over a private school in itself is a big choice that determines the future of the child. So I think there's inequality in society. We just have to accept that. Gene editing is not going to change that per se. I think the worst outcome of gene editing is if everyone decides to go in for the same gene edit and we have a society that looks completely and totally like one person. I think that would be the end of humanity if we go to try and achieve that. But for the rest of the stuff, from a governance point of view, I think your idea is just to equip people to do things with informed consent.
Okay, let's try to break this down and take it step by step, right? So let's try to build an understanding of this that's as realistic and grounded in the technology of our times and the potential benefits and risks as possible. So like it or not, human gene editing as a technology is here. It's not going away anytime soon. Potentially, it does have a lot of beneficial applications, especially when it comes to heritable diseases. Despite what I was arguing a little while ago, I was just playing the devil's advocate. I do genuinely think that there are things that human gene editing that can do, especially for a society like India, where you have this very, very long-standing legacy of kind of in-group marriage, potentially leading to a lot of, especially caste-based, social group-based heritable diseases that need to be addressed. And especially when you don't have a public health system that's capable of addressing all these at scale, gene editing might be a very smart way and efficient way to kind of nip these issues in the bud. But again, let's be realistic. Banning this technology in India when the rest of the world is adopting a more progressive stance on it means that Indian companies are not at the negotiating table, means that Indian companies are not working on this, and means that those technologies are going to mature in the rest of the world and will be accessible to Indian elites who are able to travel abroad and are able to afford those treatments, but will not be affordable to the vast majority of Indians. So it only makes sense that with the appropriate kind of clinical safeguards, with the appropriate kind of ethical safeguards, that we allow research into human gene editing to happen in India. That I think is a reasonable first step. Does that make sense, Flo?
Yeah, I'm just to clarify, we haven't banned gene editing. We have banned germline gene editing beyond 14 days of the embryo's life. So no implantation, no genetically edited babies being born. And we have a very strange definition for gene therapy products, which basically they say that you can genetically edit a human as long as it is therapeutic, but there is no definition for the therapeutic part. And that really concerns me. So for example, if I suffer from muscular dystrophy and I can genetically edit myself to have normal muscle strength, I guess that's a therapeutic product. But if I have muscular dystrophy and I actually modify myself to have a supermuscular structure, is that still therapeutic product or is that an enhancement product? Am I actually allowed to do that? I don't know. So that really concerns me, is that we have no clarity of what is actually allowed.
So the first step that India needs to take is to kind of chalk out the acceptable avenues for gene editing therapies to actually start to progress. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
To the point of actually having full-term genetically edited or perhaps germline edited babies.
Yeah, I mean, the germline edited babies, there are scientific risks. We have to accept that it has to be a slow process. It cannot be that tomorrow we will have a similar experiment that was done in China, right? But having said that, we have a moratorium on it. And that, I think, is an extreme step. We can specify standards and say that, look, you have to achieve these acceptable standards before you can actually move to making an edit in an embryo that will be implanted, right? There are a lot of liabilities that need to be sorted out in terms of what happens to the child and the parents, etc., etc. Interestingly, we do not yet have the IVF bill hasn't passed yet, and unless we have stronger regulation for assisted reproduction, which a genetically edited baby will most likely be, the genetically edit itself is going to be problematic. So first, we need to pass the ART bill, the assisted reproduction and fertility bill, and the surrogacy bill before we actually go ahead and do any of the other gene editing stuff. But still, we need to start moving on that front.
Okay, fair enough, Doc. So what is our next step? Can you just broadly summarize what we have discussed and what we think India needs to be doing? What can we take from the WHO framework on human genome editing?
Right. So the WHO framework, I have to actually mention that there is an Indian representative on the WHO Expert Advisory Board that has come up with the framework. Her name is Dr. Manisha Inamdar. She's based out of Bangalore. They have actually come up with a set of questions at the end, which have to be considered when developing governance measures. Now, India obviously already has put out a guideline structure, but I think we need to revisit that structure and see if we actually answer a lot of these questions, because I don't think that we have considered a lot of these when approaching gene editing governance. So, for example, the principles section for our gene editing governance structures is really, really bad. Whereas the WHO framework talks about responsible stewardship of science, scientific resources, fairness, inclusion, etc., which we really need to bring into our systems as well. And it talks about social justice. It talks about constant monitoring of the governance framework itself. It's something that our frameworks lack. So there are a lot of good things that are part of this WHO framework that we really need to bring in. But I think the most important is we need clarity on what we mean by gene editing. And the biggest step for me is to talk about these ethics, is to have that public engagement and conversation of what Indians really want out of technology that can literally change the way we look on Earth.
All right. Thank you so much, Doc. So I think our single biggest takeaway is don't ban. Let's talk and let's try to figure out the potential implications of a potentially world-changing technology. On that note, thank you so much for joining me, and thank you so much for listening to All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money. Some really fun guests on the network this week. Cyrus welcomed Dia Mirza to come and have a conversation about all kinds of different things. Danny Morrison was on Edges and Sledges, the cricket podcast. If you haven't heard that, that's always a fun listen. And Raul Subramanian was on Football Should Fall to grow their ever more exciting list of guests. And it's not just that. Mantra Mugdha, an old friend of ours, was on Advertising is Dead. Manu Pillai was on the Filter Coffee podcast. It's been one great guest after the other. And with that, we hope to catch you again next week.
Namaskar, dear Bandhu. My name is Ashish Vidyarthi. These are truly challenging times, and in these times, we need hope. Do take time to listen to my podcast, Begin the Journey. Available on IVM Podcasts, website, app, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Remember, there is hope because there's one life and we are alive.